The courthouse in the center of the city was known for its quiet halls and serious atmosphere. People walked through its tall doors with nervous expressions almost every day. Some came hoping for justice. Others came afraid of the decisions waiting for them inside. But one thing almost everyone agreed on was this. The judge who worked there was one of the coldest people they had ever seen. He had a reputation that traveled far beyond the courtroom. Lawyers spoke about him in careful voices. People waiting for their hearings whispered about how strict he was. He followed the rules exactly as written and expected everyone else to do the same. In his courtroom there were no jokes, no small talk, and certainly no distractions. When he entered the room each morning, everyone stood up immediately. His face almost never showed emotion. He spoke clearly and firmly, and he did not allow anyone to waste time. If someone tried to argue loudly or behave disrespectfully, he shut it down right away. Some people admired him for that. They believed the law should be handled seriously, and he certainly did that. But many others felt that something about him seemed distant, almost like a wall stood between him and the rest of the world. No one in the courthouse had ever seen him laugh. Even during breaks, he rarely spoke to anyone. When court ended each day, he usually walked straight to his office with a stack of files under his arm. He stayed late most evenings, reviewing cases long after the hallways became empty. Many employees in the building wondered what his life was like outside those walls. But nobody asked. His quiet and serious nature made people keep their distance. Inside the courthouse lobby stood something that didn't quite match the serious environment. Near a large window in the corner sat an old upright piano. It had been there for years. Most people walked past it without noticing. A long time ago, the courthouse had hosted community events and small gatherings. During those times someone would occasionally play music on the piano. But as the years passed, those events slowly disappeared. Now the piano mostly collected dust. Sometimes sunlight from the tall window would shine across its wooden surface. The keys were slightly worn, showing that at one time it had been played often. But lately, weeks could pass without anyone touching it. The courthouse staff barely remembered it was there. On one quiet afternoon, the building was slowly beginning to empty. The last cases of the day had already ended. Lawyers packed their briefcases. Clerks organized paperwork. Security guards walked through the halls making sure everything was in order. Outside, the sky was turning a soft orange as the sun began to lower. Most people were heading home. But inside one office, the judge was still working. His desk was covered with documents and notes from the day's hearings. He sat straight in his chair, reading carefully line by line. A small desk lamp lit the papers in front of him. The building had grown quiet, which was exactly how he preferred it. Silence helped him concentrate. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse doors, a teenage girl stood near the entrance holding a small backpack. She looked up at the tall building with uncertainty. For a moment she just stood there, thinking. She wasn't there for a court case. She wasn't meeting a lawyer. She had come for something much simpler. Inside her backpack were several sheets of music and a notebook filled with handwritten notes. She had an important music audition coming soon. It meant a lot to her. But there was one big problem. At home, she didn't have a piano. Her family lived in a small apartment where space was tight. Buying an instrument like that simply wasn't possible right now. Most days she practiced on a small keyboard at a local community center. But the center had been closed for repairs for nearly 2 weeks. Her audition was getting closer. She needed a real piano to practice. A few days earlier, she had walked past the courthouse and noticed the instrument sitting in the lobby. Through the glass doors she could see it clearly. At first she thought someone must use it regularly. But every time she passed the building, it remained untouched. Finally, after thinking about it for several days, she decided to take a chance. Maybe she could play quietly for a little while when the building was almost empty. She didn't plan to stay long. She only wanted to practice a few songs. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. The lobby was large and peaceful. The polished floor reflected the soft light from the ceiling. Her footsteps sounded louder than she expected as she walked across the room. For a moment she wondered if someone might stop her. But no one did. Near the window, the old piano waited quietly. She walked toward it slowly, almost as if she were approaching something important. When she reached the bench, she carefully placed her backpack on the floor. Her fingers brushed lightly across the top of the piano. A thin layer of dust rested on the wood. That confirmed what she had suspected. No one had played it for quite some time. She opened the lid gently and looked down at the keys. They were slightly yellowed with age, but they still looked strong and solid. She sat down on the bench and took a deep breath. The quiet lobby felt almost peaceful. Slowly, she placed her fingers on the keys. At first she played only a few soft notes, testing the sound. The piano responded with a warm tone that filled the space around her. Her shoulders relaxed a little. Then she began playing a simple melody she had been practicing for weeks. The music started quietly, almost like a whisper. Her fingers moved carefully across the keys as she focused on each note. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the rhythm. The empty courthouse carried the sound gently through the lobby. Upstairs in his office, the judge continued reading through the documents on his desk. At first he didn't notice anything unusual, but after a few moments, something reached his ears. A faint sound. He paused. For a second he thought he might have imagined it. Then it came again. Piano music. He looked up from his paperwork with a slight frown. The courthouse was supposed to be quiet at this hour. He listened again. Yes, there was no mistake. Someone was playing the piano in the lobby. His chair slid back as he stood up. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to break the silence he had been working in. Annoyance slowly crossed his face. This was a courthouse, not a music hall. He walked to the door of his office and opened it. The hallway outside was nearly empty, but the music was clearer now. Each step he took down the corridor made the sound stronger. The melody floated gently through the building. Downstairs, the girl continued playing, completely focused on her practice. She was thinking about the upcoming audition and trying to perfect every part of the song. She didn't realize someone was approaching. Her fingers moved faster now, gaining confidence as the music grew fuller. Meanwhile, the judge reached the staircase and began walking down toward the lobby. His footsteps were steady and firm. By the time he reached the bottom, he could clearly see the piano near the window. And sitting at the bench was a young girl playing with deep concentration. The judge stopped for a moment watching the scene. The music continued filling the room, but his expression remained serious. Then he began walking toward the piano. The sound of the piano filled the quiet courthouse lobby, echoing softly against the high ceiling and polished floor. The teenage girl sat at the bench, completely focused on the music in front of her. Her fingers moved carefully across the keys as she tried to perfect every note. She wasn't playing loudly. In fact, she was trying to keep the sound gentle, so she wouldn't disturb anyone. But she didn't know someone was already walking toward her. The judge stepped into the open lobby and immediately spotted the piano by the window. The soft sunlight from outside was fading, leaving the room in warm evening light. And there she was, sitting at the old instrument that had been silent for so long. For a moment he simply stood there. His face remained serious, the same expression people saw every day in the courtroom. The music continued playing, calm and steady. But to him it wasn't calming. It was an interruption. He had been working through important legal documents, and the unexpected sound had broken the silence he preferred. The courthouse was supposed to be quiet after hours. This place had rules, and rules mattered to him. He took several firm steps forward. His shoes echoed lightly on the floor. The girl was so focused on the melody that she didn't notice at first. She was reaching the most difficult part of the song, a section where her fingers had to move quickly and carefully. She leaned slightly closer to the piano, concentrating deeply. Then a strong voice suddenly cut through the music. "Stop!" The single word filled the lobby. Her hands froze instantly above the keys. The last note hung in the air for a second before fading into silence. Slowly, she turned around on the bench. Standing just a few steps away was the judge. Even if she had never seen him before, it was obvious who he was. His dark robe, his serious posture, and the authority in his voice made it clear. Her eyes widened in surprise. She quickly stood up from the bench, her heart suddenly racing. She hadn't expected anyone to be there, especially not someone important. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice nervous. The judge looked at her with a calm but firm expression. "This building is not a practice room," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "The courthouse is meant for legal work, not music rehearsals." The girl lowered her eyes. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone," she said quietly. She glanced toward the piano and then back at him. "I just needed a place to practice for a little while." The judge crossed his arms slightly. "That doesn't change the rules," he replied. "You cannot come here and play whenever you want." The girl nodded slowly, understanding his point. She felt embarrassed standing there in the quiet lobby. Her cheeks warmed slightly as she realized she had been caught doing something she probably shouldn't have done. "I understand," she said softly. For a moment neither of them spoke. The building felt even quieter than before. The judge looked at the backpack resting on the floor beside the piano bench. Several sheets of music were sticking out from the top. "You came here to practice?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. He studied her for a moment, trying to understand why someone her age would come all the way to a courthouse just to play piano. "Don't you have a piano at home?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, sir." Her voice remained respectful but honest. "My family lives in a small apartment. There isn't space for one." The judge remained silent. She continued speaking, explaining carefully. "There's a keyboard at a community center where I usually practice," she said. "But it's closed for repairs right now." She looked toward the piano again. "I saw this one through the window a few days ago. I thought maybe no one used it anymore." The judge glanced at the instrument. It was true that the piano had been sitting there untouched for a long time. Most people barely noticed it anymore. Still, that didn't mean the building was open for anyone to walk in and use it. "This is still a courthouse," he said. "It's not a public music studio." The girl nodded again. "I know," she replied. "I'm really sorry." She bent down and picked up her backpack from the floor. Carefully she slid the music sheets back inside. Her movements were slow, almost disappointed. "I'll leave," she said quietly. The judge watched as she prepared to go. For a moment, something about the situation felt strange. It wasn't the usual problem he dealt with. Most people who stood in front of him were arguing about serious legal matters. This was different. Just a young person who needed a place to practice music. But rules were still rules. The girl slipped one strap of the backpack over her shoulder and turned toward the courthouse doors. She took a few steps. Then she stopped. Slowly she turned back around. "Excuse me," she said carefully. The judge looked at her again, slightly surprised that she had spoken. "Yes," he replied. She hesitated for a second, gathering courage. "I know I'm not supposed to be here," she said. "And I promise I won't come again." Her voice remained polite. "But could I play just one more song before I go?" The question hung in the quiet air. The judge didn't answer immediately. He studied her expression. She wasn't trying to argue or break rules. She simply looked hopeful, like someone asking for a small favor. For a moment he considered refusing right away. That would have been the easiest answer. But something about the situation made him pause. Perhaps it was the way she had apologized so quickly, or the way she had explained her situation without complaining. The courthouse was already nearly empty. No hearings were happening. No meetings were taking place. Still, allowing this could set a strange example. He looked at the clock on the wall, then back at the piano. Finally he spoke. "One song," he said firmly. Her eyes brightened with surprise. "But only one," he added. "And then you leave." "Yes, sir," she said quickly. Relief and gratitude showed clearly on her face. She walked back to the bench and sat down again, placing her backpack gently on the floor beside her. For a moment she didn't start playing. Instead, she adjusted the sheet music in front of her. Then she rested her hands quietly on the keys. The judge remained standing nearby with his arms folded. He planned to wait until she finished and then return to his office. Nothing more. The girl closed her eyes for a brief second and took a slow breath. Then her fingers pressed the first key. A soft note floated into the quiet lobby. Then another. The melody began slowly, almost gently. The music was different from the piece she had been playing earlier. This one carried a deeper feeling, like a quiet story being told through sound. The judge listened with mild impatience at first. He expected the song to end quickly, but as the melody continued, the notes flowed smoothly together, filling the empty space of the courthouse. Outside the window, the last light of the evening faded. Inside the lobby, the piano carried the sound clearly through the still air. The girl continued playing, completely focused on the music, and the judge stood there waiting for the final note. Neither of them realized that the song she had chosen was about to change everything. The first few notes of the new song floated gently through the quiet courthouse lobby. The girl's fingers moved slowly and carefully across the piano keys. This time the melody was softer, deeper, almost thoughtful. The judge stood a few steps away with his arms folded, waiting. He still planned to return to his office as soon as she finished. To him, this was simply a short delay before getting back to his work. Nothing more. At least that's what he thought. The girl leaned slightly forward as she played, focused on every note. She wasn't trying to show off or play loudly. The music was calm and steady, like a quiet conversation. The courthouse around them felt different now. The hallways were empty. The lights above gave off a warm glow. Outside the tall window beside the piano, the sky was turning darker as evening slowly arrived. The melody continued. At first, the judge listened with little interest. He glanced briefly toward the exit doors and then toward the staircase that led back to his office. But then something unexpected happened. A few notes in the song caught his attention. His eyes shifted back toward the piano. He had heard that sequence of notes somewhere before. The feeling was strange, almost like remembering something from far away. He frowned slightly, trying to place the memory. The girl continued playing, unaware that anything unusual was happening behind her. She was simply following the music the way she had practiced it many times. The melody rose gently and then softened again. Another set of notes echoed through the room. The judge's expression slowly changed. His arms loosened slightly from their folded position. That sound, he knew it. He was certain he had heard it before. But where? The answer came slowly, like a door opening in his mind. Suddenly, a memory appeared. A living room, soft evening light through a window, and the sound of a piano. His body went still. The music in the courthouse continued playing, but now it felt different to him. He was no longer simply hearing notes. He was hearing something familiar, something personal. The girl's fingers moved gently across the keys as the melody grew more emotional. It was the kind of song that carried quiet feeling inside it. The judge took a small step closer without realizing it. His eyes remained fixed on the piano. Another piece of memory returned. Years ago, someone else had played this song. Someone very important. In his mind, he could almost see the moment clearly. A small home, a piano placed near a window, and someone sitting at the bench, smiling while playing the exact same melody. His breathing slowed. The judge had not thought about that moment for a very long time. The girl continued playing the song exactly as she had learned it. The notes flowed smoothly, filling the empty courthouse with a calm but powerful sound. The judge's serious expression softened slightly. He now understood why the melody felt so familiar. It was the same song his late wife used to play. For years she had loved that piece of music. Sometimes in the evenings she would sit at their piano and play it while he read nearby or worked at the table. At the time, he had rarely paid much attention. Back then, life was busy. His career demanded long hours, and he often focused on paperwork or case files instead of listening closely to the music. But the sound had still filled their home. Now, standing in the courthouse lobby, the same melody returned to him after so many years of silence. His hands slowly dropped to his sides. The girl played the middle section of the song, where the melody became slightly stronger before softening again. The judge's eyes remained locked on the piano. He wasn't annoyed anymore. In fact, he had completely forgotten why he had walked down from his office in the first place. Another memory surfaced. He remembered one evening long ago when his wife had practiced that same piece again and again, trying to perfect a difficult part near the end. He had teased her gently about repeating it so many times. She had laughed and said that music needed patience. Standing in the courthouse now, he could almost hear that laughter. The girl reached the same section of the song. Her fingers slowed slightly as she carefully played each note. The judge took another step closer. His face no longer carried the same cold expression people in the courtroom were used to seeing. Instead, something else appeared. Recognition, emotion, memories he had pushed aside for years were slowly rising again. The music continued flowing through the quiet building. The girl had no idea what was happening behind her. She was simply concentrating on playing the song well. To her, it was just another piece she had learned from her grandmother. But to the man standing nearby, it was something much deeper. The melody carried pieces of his past. Years ago, after his wife had passed away, he had avoided listening to that song again. It reminded him too strongly of the life they once shared. Over time, he had buried those memories under work and responsibility. He became more serious, more distant. The courtroom became the place where he spent most of his energy. Rules, decisions, and legal arguments filled his days. Music slowly disappeared from his life. Until now, the girl continued playing, moving toward the final section of the song. The melody softened again, becoming calm and gentle. The judge stood quietly just a few feet away from the piano. His eyes followed the movement of her hands across the keys. For the first time in many years, he felt something unexpected inside his chest. Not anger, not frustration, something quieter, a deep sense of remembering. The last part of the melody approached. The girl slowed slightly, making sure each note was clear and careful. The courthouse remained completely silent except for the music. Even the usual sounds of footsteps or voices from other offices were gone. The building seemed to be listening. The final notes arrived. Soft, peaceful. One by one they faded into the still air of the lobby. The girl lifted her hands from the piano keys. For a moment she stayed seated, letting the last sound disappear completely. Then she turned slowly on the bench. She expected to see the same serious judge standing there, ready to remind her that it was time to leave. But when she looked at him, something felt different. He wasn't standing with his arms crossed anymore. He wasn't looking impatient either. Instead, he was standing very still, staring at the piano as if lost in thought. The girl hesitated, unsure what to say. "Sir?" she asked quietly. The judge blinked slightly, as if returning from far away. His eyes shifted from the piano to the girl. For the first time since she had seen him, his expression was not cold. It was thoughtful, almost emotional. And in that quiet courthouse lobby, something had clearly changed. For a few seconds after the final note faded away, the courthouse lobby stayed completely quiet. The girl slowly turned on the piano bench, expecting the judge to remind her again that she needed to leave. But something felt different. The man who had walked toward her earlier with a firm voice and strict expression was now standing still, almost frozen in place. His eyes were fixed on the piano keys. The girl hesitated. "Sir?" she said softly. The judge blinked as if he had just returned from deep thought. His gaze slowly lifted from the piano to the girl sitting on the bench. For the first time since she had seen him, his expression looked uncertain. He didn't speak right away. The girl felt a little nervous again. She wasn't sure if she had done something wrong by playing that particular song. Maybe she had taken too long. Maybe she had broken some rule without realizing it. "I'm sorry if I played too long," she said quietly. "I was trying to finish the piece properly." The judge shook his head slowly. "No," he said. His voice sounded calmer now, almost distant. "You didn't play too long." He looked back at the piano again, as if studying it in a new way. Then he asked a question. "Where did you learn that song?" The girl looked slightly surprised by the question. "That one?" she asked. "Yes." She thought for a moment before answering. "My grandmother taught it to me," she said. The judge's eyes shifted back to her. Your grandmother? She nodded. She used to play piano when she was younger. She knows a lot of older songs that people don't play very often anymore. The judge remained quiet, listening carefully. The girl continued. She showed me this one about 2 years ago. She told me it was very special. The judge took a slow breath. Did she tell you where it came from? The girl shook her head. Not really. She just said it's the kind of song that should be played with feeling, not just with your hands. The judge looked back at the piano again. Played with feeling. Those words sounded familiar. His late wife used to say almost the same thing. Another memory quietly returned to his mind. He remembered standing in their living room years ago while she practiced that exact melody. She had paused in the middle of the piece and told him that music wasn't about playing perfectly. It was about understanding the emotion behind every note. At the time he had smiled politely but returned to his paperwork. Now that moment came back to him with surprising clarity. The girl watched the judge carefully. She could tell he was thinking about something deeply. She wasn't sure what. Did I play it wrong? She asked gently. The judge quickly shook his head again. No, he said. Then he paused before speaking again. You played it exactly the way it should be played. The girl relaxed slightly. That's good, she said with a small smile. I always try to play it the way my grandmother showed me. The judge looked toward the window beside the piano. Outside, the sky had grown darker, and the city lights were beginning to appear. For a long moment he didn't say anything. The girl quietly gathered her sheet music from the piano stand, thinking it was probably time for her to leave now. But before she could stand up, the judge spoke again. That song, he said slowly, was my wife's favorite. The girl looked up, surprised. Your wife? She repeated. The judge nodded. She used to play it often. His voice remained calm, but there was something different in the way he spoke now. The girl listened quietly. She loved the piano, he continued. In the evenings, after dinner, she would sit down and play while the house grew quiet. He looked at the piano keys again. That melody was one of the pieces she practiced the most. The girl sat still on the bench, listening carefully. She had not expected to hear something so personal from a man who seemed so serious earlier. The judge took another slow breath. It has been many years since I last heard that song, he said. Really? The girl asked. He nodded again. Yes. For a moment he seemed unsure how much more to say. But the quiet lobby gave him space to speak. After she passed away, he continued slowly, I stopped listening to piano music. The girl lowered her eyes slightly, showing respect. I'm sorry, she said softly. The judge gave a small nod, acknowledging her words. Thank you. He looked around the lobby as if noticing the building again. It's strange, he added quietly. I've walked through this room hundreds of times. That piano has been sitting here for years. He paused. But I never once thought about hearing that song again. The girl glanced at the instrument. I almost didn't play it today, she admitted. The judge looked back at her. Why not? I was planning to practice a different piece for my audition, she explained. But when you allowed me one last song, I suddenly remembered this one. She smiled slightly. It just felt right. The judge stood silently for a moment. The idea that such a simple decision had brought back so many memories surprised him. For years he had lived his life in a careful routine. Work filled most of his time, and the past stayed quietly behind him. But tonight, in the middle of a courthouse lobby, a young musician had reopened a memory he thought he had buried forever. The girl gently placed her sheet music back into her backpack. I should probably go now, she said politely. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the piano. Then he looked at her. You said you have an audition soon, he said. Yes, she replied. When is it? In about 3 weeks. He nodded slowly. And you don't have a piano at home? No. For a moment the judge thought quietly. The girl waited respectfully. Finally he spoke again. You may practice here, he said. The girl blinked in surprise. Here? She asked. He nodded. After court hours, he clarified. When the building is quiet. Her eyes widened slightly. Are you serious? Yes. A small smile appeared on her face. Thank you, she said quickly. I promise I'll be careful. The judge gave a small nod. I expect you will be. The girl lifted her backpack and stood up from the bench. As she walked toward the doors, she turned back for a moment. I'm glad I played that song, she said. The judge looked at the piano again. So am I, he replied quietly. And in that quiet courthouse lobby, something inside him had begun to change. The courthouse lobby grew quiet again after the girl walked out through the glass doors. The sound of her footsteps slowly faded as she stepped into the evening outside. For a moment the judge remained standing near the piano, looking at the spot where she had been sitting only a few minutes earlier. The building felt different now. Just before she arrived, the courthouse had been silent in the usual way he liked. It was the type of silence that helped him focus on work and forget everything else. But the silence now felt heavier. The judge slowly turned his attention back to the piano. The old instrument stood beside the window exactly the same as before, but it no longer seemed like just a forgotten piece of furniture. He walked closer to it. The bench was still slightly pushed back from where the girl had stood up. A faint mark in the dust showed where her hands had rested on the top of the piano earlier. He looked down at the keys. For years he had passed this piano without thinking about it. It had simply been part of the building, something that belonged to the past when the courthouse hosted small community events. Now it held a different meaning. The melody she had played still echoed quietly in his memory. He reached out and lightly touched one of the piano keys. A single soft note sounded in the empty lobby. The judge quickly pulled his hand back as if surprised by the sound. It had been many years since he had touched a piano. Another memory surfaced in his mind. He remembered standing beside his wife years ago while she practiced at their piano at home. Sometimes she would ask him to press a key for her while she adjusted the sheet music. He had never been much of a musician, but he enjoyed watching her play. Back then the house had felt warm and full of life. The judge slowly stepped away from the piano. For a moment he considered sitting down at the bench just to look at the keys more closely. But he stopped himself. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the staircase. His office still waited upstairs with the same stack of legal documents he had been reviewing earlier. But when he returned to his desk and sat down, something felt different. He picked up the top file and tried to continue reading where he had left off. The words were clear. The details of the case were familiar. But his mind kept drifting back to the music. He set the papers down again. The melody played softly inside his thoughts, note by note. It had been so long since he allowed himself to remember that song. For years he had focused entirely on work. Court cases filled his schedule from morning until evening. The responsibility of making difficult decisions had become the center of his life. It was easier that way. Work required focus, logic, and discipline. Memories required something else. Something he had avoided. But tonight the music had reached a part of him he had kept closed. Downstairs, the old piano remained silent again. The judge looked toward the window in his office. The city lights outside were brighter now as night fully arrived. After a long moment he stood up again. Instead of returning to the paperwork, he walked out of his office and back toward the staircase. His footsteps echoed quietly through the empty hallway. When he reached the lobby again, the piano stood exactly where he had left it. The judge walked over to it slowly. This time he sat down on the bench. For a few seconds he simply looked at the keys. They were slightly worn from years of use. Some of them showed faint marks where fingers had pressed them countless times before. He placed both hands gently on the keyboard. Nothing happened at first. He wasn't planning to play a song. He didn't remember how. But after a moment he pressed a single key again. A soft note filled the quiet space. Then he pressed another. The sound was simple and uneven. Nothing like the smooth melody the girl had played earlier. He shook his head slightly at himself. I never had the patience for this, he murmured quietly. His wife had once tried to teach him a few basic notes. He had lasted about 10 minutes before laughing and giving up. Now he realized how much joy she had found in something so simple. The judge lifted his hands from the piano and stood up again. At that moment he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. One of the courthouse security guards appeared near the entrance of the lobby. The guard stopped for a moment when he saw the judge standing near the piano. "Good evening, Your Honor," the guard said respectfully. "Good evening," the judge replied. The guard glanced at the piano and then back at the judge. "Everything all right?" "Yes," the judge answered. He paused for a moment before adding something unexpected. "You may hear someone playing this piano again in the evenings." The guard looked surprised. "Someone playing here?" he asked. "A young musician," the judge explained calmly. "She will be practicing after court hours." The guard nodded slowly. "That sounds nice," he said with a small smile. "This building could use a little music." The judge didn't reply right away, but he understood the truth in that statement. For years, the courthouse had been filled with serious conversations, legal arguments, and difficult decisions. Music had never been part of that environment. But maybe it didn't have to stay that way. The guard continued his walk through the building, leaving the judge alone again in the lobby. The judge looked once more at the piano. Tomorrow the courthouse would return to its usual routine. Lawyers would hurry through the halls, people would wait nervously for their hearings, and he would take his seat at the bench once again. But now he knew something new would happen after the day ended. Music would return to this quiet space. And for the first time in many years, he realized he was actually looking forward to hearing it again. The next afternoon, the courthouse was busy as usual. Court cases filled the schedule, and people moved through the building with serious expressions. But something unusual happened during one of the breaks between hearings. A clerk who worked nearby noticed the judge standing near a window in the hallway. He seemed lost in thought. "Your Honor?" the clerk asked politely. The judge turned slightly. "Yes. Your next hearing will begin in 5 minutes." "Thank you," the judge replied. As the clerk walked away, the judge glanced down toward the lobby below. The piano sat quietly in the corner, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, the judge found himself wondering when evening would arrive. The next evening, the courthouse followed the same routine it had followed for many years. Lawyers arrived early carrying files and documents. People sat quietly in the waiting area, whispering to each other about their cases. Clerks moved back and forth between offices, organizing paperwork and preparing for the day's hearings. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat behind the bench just as he always did. From the outside, nothing about him seemed different. His posture was straight. His voice remained calm and firm. He listened carefully to every argument presented in front of him and made his decisions based on the law, exactly as he always had. To everyone else in the room, he was still the same strict and serious judge they had known for years. But inside his mind, something had shifted. Several times during the day, he caught himself remembering the sound of the piano from the evening before. The melody had stayed with him longer than he expected. Every once in a while, a few notes returned quietly to his thoughts. He never mentioned it to anyone. The courtroom was not a place for personal stories. Still, the memory remained. The hours of hearings continued until late afternoon. One by one, the final cases of the day came to an end. Lawyers packed their files and thanked the judge politely before leaving. Court staff began organizing the paperwork from the sessions. Eventually, the courtroom grew empty again. The judge closed the last folder on his desk and stood up slowly. He removed his robe and placed it carefully over the back of his chair. Most evenings, he would return to his office and continue working on documents. But tonight, he paused for a moment. Instead of walking toward his office right away, he stepped out into the hallway. His footsteps echoed softly as he walked toward the staircase that led down to the lobby. The building was already growing quieter. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he could see the old piano standing near the window, just as it had been the night before. But this time something was different. The teenage girl was already there. She sat at the piano bench with a small stack of sheet music beside her. Her backpack rested on the floor nearby. She hadn't started playing yet. Instead, she was carefully arranging the music pages and adjusting the bench. When she noticed the judge walking toward the lobby, She quickly stood up. "Good evening, sir," she said politely. The judge nodded slightly. "Good evening." For a brief moment neither of them spoke. Then the girl smiled a little. "I hope it's still okay for me to practice here," she said. "It is," the judge replied calmly. "As long as it remains after court hours." "It will," she said quickly. "I made sure to wait until everything finished." The judge gave a small nod. He stood nearby but didn't say anything else. The girl looked back at the piano. "I'll try not to play too loudly," she added. "That won't be necessary," the judge said. She looked slightly surprised by the answer. The judge gestured lightly toward the bench. "You may begin whenever you're ready." The girl sat down again and placed her hands gently on the keys. For a moment she simply looked at the sheet music in front of her. Then she started playing. The first notes were soft and careful, just like the evening before. But this time the song was different. It was a brighter melody, one that moved a little faster. The sound traveled through the quiet courthouse lobby, filling the empty space with music. The judge stood a few steps away, listening. At first he remained still, his hands resting behind his back. But as the melody continued, he slowly walked closer to the piano. Not close enough to interrupt, just close enough to hear every note clearly. The girl focused on her playing, practicing the same section several times to make sure she performed it correctly. Occasionally she stopped to adjust the sheet music or try a different part again. The judge noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. Practicing music required patience. The girl repeated certain parts again and again, carefully improving each note. It reminded him of how musicians slowly build their skill over time. After a few minutes she finished one piece and looked over her shoulder. "Was that too loud?" she asked. The judge shook his head. "No." She smiled slightly. "Good." Then she turned back and began practicing another song. The evening continued like that for nearly an hour. The courthouse remained quiet except for the piano. The security guard who passed through the lobby earlier paused for a moment to listen before continuing his rounds. Upstairs, a few remaining staff members noticed the music drifting softly through the halls. Some of them stopped briefly near the staircase, curious about the unexpected sound. Downstairs, the judge continued listening. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He simply stood nearby, letting the music fill the space. At one point she began playing the same song she had performed the night before. The melody returned gently. When the first familiar notes reached his ears, the judge's expression softened again. The memories came back, but this time they didn't feel as heavy. Instead of sadness, the music brought a quiet sense of peace. The girl finished the song and turned around. "I'm getting better at that one," she said. "You are," the judge replied. She looked pleased. "My grandmother will be happy to hear that." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandmother gave you a valuable gift," he said. "She did," the girl agreed. The evening slowly came to an end. The girl gathered her sheet music and placed it carefully into her backpack. "Thank you again for letting me practice here," she said sincerely. "You're welcome," the judge replied. She hesitated for a moment before asking another question. "Do you like hearing the piano again?" The judge looked at the instrument beside the window. For a few seconds he didn't answer. Then he spoke honestly. "Yes," he said. "I do." The girl smiled warmly. "That makes me happy." She waved politely before walking toward the courthouse doors. "See you tomorrow evening," she said. "See you tomorrow," the judge replied. The doors closed quietly behind her as she stepped outside. The judge remained in the lobby for a moment longer. The piano stood silent again, but the building no longer felt empty the way it once had. Over the next few weeks, the girl returned almost every evening to practice for her audition. Each time the judge allowed her to use the piano. Sometimes he listened from nearby. Other times he simply passed through the lobby and paused for a moment before continuing his work. Gradually the courthouse staff noticed a small change in him. He still took his responsibilities seriously. But occasionally, when the day ended and music filled the lobby, the strict judge who never smiled seemed a little less distant. And every time the familiar melody returned to the old piano, He quietly remembered the person who once loved that song. Not with sadness anymore, but with gratitude for the music that had found its way back into his life.